What if the reason you can't move on isn't because you're weak, but because no one ever taught you how to put something down? You have carried things for so long that you forgot they were ever meant to be set down. A conversation that ended badly 7 years ago. A version of yourself you're ashamed of. A love that didn't work out the way you needed it to. You keep replaying it, turning it over, looking for the moment where you could have done something different. And underneath all of that replaying is a quiet, exhausting question you rarely say out loud: will I ever feel light again? This video is about 10 habits, small enough to start today, that come from a tradition that has spent over 2,000 years studying exactly this kind of suffering. Not to erase your pain, not to pretend it didn't happen, but to help you finally understand what to do with it. By the end, something in you is going to loosen. Stay with it. Here is the problem most people never say clearly, even to themselves. You think healing means arriving somewhere, a day when you wake up and the hurt is simply gone. So you wait for that day. You wait while scrolling through old messages. You wait while rehearsing arguments with people who aren't even in the room anymore. You wait while quietly punishing yourself for not being over it already. And the waiting becomes its own kind of prison, quieter than the original pain, but somehow heavier, because now you are also carrying the shame of still carrying it. Buddhist teaching offers something different. It doesn't tell you healing is a destination. It tells you healing is a series of small releases, practiced daily, the way you'd practice breathing if you'd forgotten how. Let's walk through them, sitting with what you feel instead of running from it. There is a moment, right before the feeling hits, when you already know it's coming. Maybe it's a smell that pulls you back to a room you don't want to remember. Maybe it's a song that used to mean nothing and now means everything. Maybe it's just the quiet of your apartment at 10 at night, when there's no one left to talk to and no task left to hide behind, and the feeling rises up like water finding its level. In that moment, almost everyone does the same thing. You reach for your phone, you turn on a show you're not even watching. You start a conversation with someone just so the silence doesn't have room to say anything. This is not weakness. This is instinct. The same instinct that made your ancestors run from danger, except the danger here isn't a predator in the grass. It's a feeling in your chest, and feelings cannot be outrun, no matter how fast you move. The old teachers understood this pattern long before anyone had a word for distraction. They watched people suffer, and they noticed that most suffering wasn't caused by the original wound. It was caused by everything people did to avoid feeling the wound honestly. Every time you distract yourself from a feeling, you don't actually make it smaller. You just postpone it, and postponed pain has interest. It grows heavier the longer it waits. The way an unopened letter grows more frightening the longer it sits on the table. You already know this if you're honest with yourself. Think of a time you avoided a hard emotion for weeks, only to have it come out sideways, as anger at someone who didn't deserve it, or as exhaustion that no amount of sleep could fix. That was the postponed feeling, finally demanding to be paid. So what does it actually mean to sit with a feeling? It doesn't mean drowning in it. It doesn't mean replaying the worst parts of your life on a loop until you're raw. It means something much smaller and much harder. Staying in the room with the feeling instead of leaving. Imagine the feeling as a guest who has shown up uninvited, upset, maybe even shouting. Your instinct is to shut the door, to pretend you're not home. But shutting the door doesn't make the guest leave. It just makes them stand outside, getting louder. Sitting with a feeling means opening the door, letting the guest in, offering them a chair, and simply staying present while they speak. You don't have to agree with everything the feeling says. Fear will tell you that you're not safe, even when you are. Shame will tell you that you're unworthy, even when you're not. But you can let the feeling speak its piece, without treating every word as fact. This is where breath becomes useful, not as a trick, to make the feeling disappear, but as an anchor that keeps you in the room. You breathe in, slowly, and you notice where the feeling lives in your body. Maybe it's a tightness behind your ribs, or a heaviness in your shoulders, or a heat rising in your face. You don't need to name it perfectly. You don't need a therapist's vocabulary. You just need to notice it the way you'd notice weather. This is what's happening in me right now, without immediately trying to change the forecast. And here is the strange part that almost no one believes until they experience it themselves. Feelings that are fully felt do not last forever. They rise, they peak, and then, without you doing anything dramatic, they begin to fall. Not because you fixed anything, just because that's what feelings do when they're finally allowed to move instead of being locked in a room by themselves. Think about a wave in the ocean. A wave that hits the shore doesn't stay there forever, piling higher and higher. It rises, it crashes, and it pulls back into the sea, making space for the next one. Your emotions work the same way, if you let them. The exhaustion you feel after a hard cry isn't a sign that something is wrong with you. It's a sign that something finally moved. The heaviness that lifts slightly after you finally admit out loud that you're struggling isn't magic. It's the natural motion of a feeling that was finally given room instead of being locked outside in the cold. Most people fear that if they sit with sadness, it will swallow them completely, that there will be no bottom, that they'll fall and keep falling. But sadness, like everything else, has a flaw. It has an edge. It is not actually infinite, even though it feels that way in the middle of it. The only way to discover this for yourself is to stop running long enough to find out. This doesn't mean you do it alone, and it doesn't mean you do it all at once. It means, today, in one small moment, you let yourself feel one honest thing without immediately trying to escape it. Maybe it's 5 seconds at first. Maybe it's the length of one breath. That's enough to start. The muscle grows the more you use it. There's a kind of quiet that comes after you've finally sat with a feeling instead of fleeing it. Not the tense, holding your breath kind of quiet, but the exhausted, open kind, like a house after a storm has passed through and left the windows rattling but intact. That quiet is not empty, it's clear. And in that clarity, for the first time in a long time, you can actually think, actually breathe, actually notice what you need next. Not because the pain is gone forever, but because you finally let it move, instead of asking it to freeze in place while you looked away. Letting the story end before you start a new one. There's a particular kind of tiredness that doesn't come from lack of sleep. It comes from telling the same story to yourself, over and over, hoping that this time, the ending will be different. You know the story. You've told it in the shower, in traffic, in the middle of a meeting when you should have been listening to someone else entirely. It usually starts with what happened, moves through what you wish you'd said, and ends, always, somewhere unfinished. Because the real ending, the one that actually happened, isn't the one you wanted. So instead of accepting that ending, you keep rewriting it in your head, hoping that enough repetition will somehow change the facts. It never does. But the rewriting itself becomes exhausting, a second job you never applied for, running quietly in the background of every ordinary moment. This habit isn't about forgetting what happened. Nobody is asking you to pretend the story didn't exist. It's about recognizing the difference between remembering something and still living inside it. You can remember a painful chapter of your life the way you'd remember a scene from a film you watched years ago, with clarity, maybe even with some lingering feeling, but from the outside, as someone who has already left the theater. Or you can still be sitting in that theater, watching the same scene loop endlessly, refusing to stand up and walk into the lobby where the rest of your life is waiting. The difference isn't the memory. The difference is where you're standing in relation to it. Old teachers spoke about this using the image of a river. A river doesn't try to hold on to the water that has already passed. It doesn't reach backward, begging yesterday's water to stay. It simply keeps moving, letting new water take the place of the old. Because that's the nature of a river. If it stopped moving, it would become a stagnant pond, still and heavy, and starting to smell of everything it refused to release. Your life is meant to move the same way, but you were never taught how to let a chapter close. No one hands you a ceremony for this. No one tells you when it's officially over. So you're left holding the ending yourself, deciding, quietly, privately, without anyone's permission, this happened, it shaped me, and now it is finished. This decision doesn't erase what came before it. In fact, closing a chapter properly requires you to fully acknowledge what was in it, not skip past it. You cannot end a story you haven't actually finished reading. This means allowing yourself to admit, without flinching, what really happened, not the version you've softened for other people, and not the version you've exaggerated for yourself in moments of self-pity, but the honest, plain version. This happened. It hurt. It is over. Saying this plainly, even quietly to an empty room, has more power than most people realize, because it takes the story out of the shadowy space where it's been growing bigger than it actually was, and it brings it into the light where its true size becomes clear. Once a story truly ends, something curious happens. Silence. Not a dramatic silence, not an empty ache, but a strange, almost unfamiliar quiet. The kind you feel in a house, right after guests have left, and the dishes are done, and there's nothing left to do but sit in the stillness. Many people are so unused to this kind of quiet that they mistake it for something being wrong. They rush to fill it immediately with a new distraction, a new relationship, a new problem to solve, because silence after an ending can feel uncomfortably close to loneliness. But it isn't loneliness, it's space. It's the natural gap between one chapter and the next. And if you can tolerate that gap without panicking, without rushing to fill it, you give yourself the rare gift of choosing what comes next, instead of just reacting to whatever fills the emptiness first. Think about how a farmer treats a field after harvest. The field isn't immediately planted again. It rests. It looks, to an untrained eye, like nothing is happening. Bare soil, no visible growth, no obvious purpose. But that resting period is essential. It's where the soil recovers what it lost, quietly, invisibly, preparing itself to hold something new. If the farmer planted again too quickly, without allowing that rest, the next crop would grow in exhausted ground and never reach its full strength. Your life needs the same kind of rest between chapters. The urge to immediately start something new, a relationship, a project, a total reinvention of yourself, right after a painful ending, often comes from an inability to sit in that bare, quiet field. But the field isn't empty because something is wrong. It's empty because it's healing. So today, if there's a story you've been telling yourself for months or years, one that never quite reaches a satisfying ending, no matter how many times you replay it, consider this. The ending isn't going to arrive from outside. No apology, no explanation, no perfect closure is coming to complete it for you. You are the only one who can close that book, and you can do it exactly the way you closed books as a child. Not by understanding every part of the story perfectly, but simply by turning the last page, setting it down, and letting your eyes rest on whatever is ahead of you now. Watching your thoughts without becoming them. Somewhere very early in life, you learned to believe every thought that passed through your mind. No one taught you this on purpose. It happened quietly, the way most important lessons do, without any ceremony at all. A thought arrived. You're going to fail this. They don't really like you. Something bad is about to happen. And instead of noticing it, the way you'd notice a stranger walking by, you grabbed onto it, pulled it close, and let it become the truth you were living inside of for the rest of the day. This habit is so old and so automatic that most people never even question it. They assume that if a thought appears in their mind, it must be theirs, and if it's theirs, it must be true. But thoughts are not facts. They are events. They rise the way clouds rise, drift the way clouds drift, and eventually pass, the way all clouds eventually pass, unless you decide to grab onto one and hold it in place, refusing to let the sky move on. Picture the mind as a wide open sky. Some days the sky is clear, calm, easy to look at. Other days it's crowded with dark clouds, moving fast, occasionally letting out thunder that startles you. But even on the darkest day, the sky itself is never actually damaged by the clouds passing through it. The sky doesn't become the storm. It simply holds the storm for a while, and then, without effort, without struggle, the storm passes, and the sky remains exactly as open and vast as it always was. Your awareness is like that sky. Your thoughts are like the clouds. The mistake almost everyone makes is believing that they are the clouds, that every dark, frightening, or angry thought is a permanent description of who they are, rather than a temporary weather pattern passing through an awareness that was never actually damaged by any of it. This is a hard thing to believe at first, because thoughts can feel so convincing. A thought that says you are unlovable doesn't announce itself as a thought. It feels like a fact, delivered with total confidence, wearing the exact voice of truth. This is one of the mind's oldest tricks. It doesn't label its more painful thoughts as opinions or fears. It presents them as certainties, and because you're used to trusting your own mind, you accept them the way you'd accept a message from a source you've never had reason to doubt. But minds, especially tired or hurting minds, are not always reliable narrators. They exaggerate, they catastrophize, they repeat old fears long after those fears have stopped being useful. Watching your thoughts means, for the first time, questioning the source, not with hostility, but with the same calm curiosity you'd bring to a stranger's opinion. Interesting that this thought showed up, but is it actually true, or is it just loud? There's a specific practice hidden inside this habit, one that sounds almost too simple to work, and yet it changes everything once you actually try it. When a difficult thought arrives, instead of saying, "I am worthless," or "I am going to fail," you say, quietly, in your own mind, "I am having the thought that I am worthless," or "I am having the thought that I am going to fail." This small shift in language creates a small amount of space between you and the thought, just enough space for you to remember that the thought is something passing through you, not something that defines you. It's the difference between being caught in a rainstorm with no shelter and standing under an awning, watching the rain fall without being soaked by it. The rain is still there. You're just no longer confusing yourself with the rain. This kind of watching takes practice because the mind resists being watched. It's used to running the show unquestioned, used to being obeyed instantly, and when you first start observing your thoughts, instead of automatically believing them, it can feel oddly uncomfortable, even a little disorienting, the way it feels strange to hear a recording of your own voice for the first time. But over time, this watching becomes more natural, and something remarkable starts to happen. The thoughts don't necessarily stop coming. Fear still shows up. Doubt still shows up. Old, familiar shame still knocks on the door sometimes, uninvited, but they no longer carry the same weight, because you've stopped mistaking every visitor for a permanent resident. There is a particular kind of quiet that comes from this practice. Not the silence of an empty mind, because the mind is rarely fully empty, but the silence of a mind that is no longer reacting to everything with panic. Thoughts still pass through, the way birds pass through open sky, but you're no longer chasing every single one, trying to catch it, trying to understand exactly why it's there. You simply notice and let it continue on its way. This is not indifference. It is not coldness. It is, actually, one of the gentlest things you can do for yourself, to stop treating your own mind as an enemy that must be obeyed, and start treating it as weather that you are allowed to observe from somewhere calm, somewhere steady, somewhere that was never actually touched by the storm in the first place. Releasing the need to be understood by everyone. There's a specific kind of exhaustion that comes from explaining yourself to someone who was never going to understand, no matter how carefully you chose your words. You've felt this. You sit across from someone, or you type out a long message, trying to make them see exactly how much something hurt, exactly why a certain sentence cut so deep, exactly what it cost you to get through that week. And even after all that effort, you can see it in their face, or feel it in the flatness of their reply. They didn't get it. Not fully, maybe not at all. And in that moment, something in you deflates, because somewhere along the way, you had convinced yourself that your pain wasn't real, or wasn't valid, until someone else confirmed it for you. This is one of the quieter traps that keeps people stuck for years. You start believing that healing requires an audience, that you need someone to say, "I understand," or "you were right to feel that way," before you're allowed to actually feel it and move through it. So you keep explaining, you keep replaying the story for new listeners, hoping that this time, finally, someone will say the words that make it feel real, make it feel justified, make it feel like it's finally okay to let go. But here's the truth almost no one tells you. You can wait your whole life for that perfect understanding, and it may never come. Not because your pain wasn't real, but because other people are living inside their own storms, their own distractions, their own limited capacity to truly hold someone else's experience. Their inability to fully understand you was never proof that your pain didn't matter. It was only proof that they are human, with their own narrow window of attention, just like you are. Think about how much energy you've spent trying to be understood by people who simply don't have the tools to understand you. Not because they're cruel, but because they've never walked through what you've walked through, or because they're too tangled in their own noise to truly listen. You've probably told the same story to 5 different people, hoping that the 6th telling would finally land the way you needed it to. And maybe, in the middle of that 5th or 6th telling, some quiet part of you started to wonder if you were the problem, if you were somehow explaining it wrong, if a clearer story would finally get you the response you were craving. But the response was never really about your storytelling skills. It was about the limits of what other people can hold, limits that have nothing to do with your worth or the truth of what happened to you. The old teaching here is a strange kind of relief once you actually absorb it. Your healing does not depend on anyone else's validation. It never did. This doesn't mean other people's support isn't valuable. A friend who truly listens, who sits with you in your pain without trying to fix it or minimize it, is one of the rarest gifts a person can receive. But depending entirely on that kind of understanding, waiting for it before you allow yourself to heal, hands your recovery over to people who may never be capable of giving you what you need. And that's an enormous amount of power to give away to circumstances completely outside your control. Imagine, instead, turning that same energy inward. Instead of explaining your pain to someone else for the 10th time, hoping this explanation finally lands, you sit with yourself and ask, quietly, do I understand what happened to me? Do I understand why it hurt this much? Can I hold this experience with honesty, even if no one else ever fully grasps it the way I do? This shift doesn't happen overnight, and it can feel oddly lonely at first, like closing a door you didn't realize you'd been standing in for years. But there's a kind of strength that grows in that private understanding, a strength that doesn't collapse the moment someone responds to your story with a shrug, instead of the depth you were hoping for. There's an old image that captures this well, a lantern that lights its own path, rather than waiting for someone else to hold up the light. For a long time you may have been standing in the dark, waiting for someone to walk over with their own lantern and illuminate your situation for you, waiting for their light to confirm that what you were feeling actually made sense. But you were never actually powerless in that darkness. You had your own light the whole time. It just took a long time to remember you were allowed to use it without permission from anyone else. Letting go of the need to be understood by everyone doesn't mean becoming cold or closed off. It means becoming more discerning about where you spend your emotional honesty, and more willing to hold that honesty yourself when the right listener isn't available. You stop performing your pain for an audience that may never fully appreciate it, and instead, you start speaking to yourself the way you'd speak to someone you deeply respect, clearly, patiently, without needing applause or confirmation at the end. Over time, this creates a quiet kind of independence, not the isolated kind that shuts everyone out, but the grounded kind that no longer trembles every time someone fails to respond the way you hoped. You still share your life with others. You still let people in, but you no longer hand them the keys to whether your experience was valid. Those keys were always yours. And once you finally hold them yourself, something in your chest loosens, the particular tightness that comes from constantly performing your own pain, hoping someone in the audience finally claps. Forgiving without waiting for an apology. There is a very specific kind of waiting that quietly ruins years of a person's life, and it rarely gets talked about directly. It's the waiting for an apology that may never come. You replay the moment someone hurt you, and somewhere in that replay, there's a fantasy, a version where they finally call, finally admit what they did, finally say the exact words you've been needing to hear. You've probably rehearsed that fantasy conversation more times than you'd like to admit, lying awake, imagining the moment they finally understand the damage they caused. But here is the uncomfortable truth. Some people never apologize. Not because your pain wasn't real, but because they may never have the self-awareness, the courage, or even the memory of the moment the way you do. And if your peace depends on their apology arriving, you may spend years, even decades, standing at a door that no one is ever going to open. This is where forgiveness gets misunderstood by almost everyone. Most people think forgiveness means telling the other person it's okay, that what they did wasn't really that bad, that you're willing to pretend it didn't happen in order to keep the relationship intact. This is not forgiveness. This is self-erasure dressed up as peace. Real forgiveness has almost nothing to do with the other person at all. It's not a message sent to them, it's a decision made entirely within you, about you, for you. It is the moment you finally stop making your own peace conditional on someone else's growth, honesty, or memory. Think of resentment as a hot coal you've been holding in your hand, waiting for the right moment to throw it at the person who hurt you. The problem is, the longer you hold it, waiting for the perfect moment of justice, the more it burns your own hand. The other person may not even know you're holding it. They may have moved on entirely, living their life without a single thought about what they did to you, while you're still standing there, palm blistered, waiting for a moment that will never fully satisfy you, even if it does arrive. Forgiveness is the moment you finally set the coal down, not because they deserve you to let go, and not because what happened was acceptable, but because your hand deserves to stop burning. This kind of forgiveness can happen entirely in private, without ever informing the person who hurt you. You don't need to send a message telling them you forgive them. You don't need reconciliation, or even contact. You can sit alone, in complete silence, and simply acknowledge, quietly, what happened, happened. It caused real damage. I am allowed to stop waiting for something that may never come, and I am allowed to release this weight, not for their sake, but for mine. This moment, small as it seems, is one of the most powerful shifts a person can make, because it takes your peace out of someone else's hands and finally places it back into your own. There's an old teaching that compares an unforgiving heart to a person walking through life carrying a heavy stone, believing that the stone is punishing the person who gave it to them. But the person who caused the harm isn't carrying that stone at all. They walked away long ago, unburdened, while you're the one whose shoulders ache, whose back bends slightly under a weight that was never yours to keep. Forgiveness isn't handing them anything. It's finally setting the stone down on the ground and walking forward without it, regardless of whether they ever acknowledge they were the one who handed it to you in the first place. None of this means forgetting. None of this means pretending the harm wasn't real, or allowing the same harm to happen again without boundaries. Forgiveness and trust are not the same thing. You can forgive someone completely and still choose never to let them close to you again. Forgiveness is about your internal weight. Trust is about your external boundaries. You are allowed to release the coal and still keep your hand closed around anything you decide to protect going forward. The apology you've been waiting for might come one day. It might not. Either way, your healing was never supposed to depend on their willingness to admit what they did. That was always too much power to give someone who has already shown you, through their silence, exactly how much responsibility they're willing to take. The quiet moment you finally forgive without permission, without apology, without any acknowledgement at all, is the moment you take your life back from someone who may not have even known they still had a hold on it. Loving yourself the way you once loved someone else. Think back to a time you loved someone deeply, the patience you had for them, the softness in your voice even when they disappointed you, the way you found excuses for their bad days, reminding yourself they were only human, they were doing their best, they deserved grace even in their worst moments. Now, honestly, ask yourself, when was the last time you spoke to yourself that way? For most people, the answer is uncomfortable. Somewhere along the way, you learned to reserve your deepest patience, your gentlest tone, your most generous interpretations for everyone except yourself. You became fluent in a language of kindness that you only ever speak to other people, while the voice in your own head remained sharp, critical, and impossible to satisfy. This asymmetry rarely gets questioned because it feels so normal. You've grown so used to speaking harshly to yourself, replaying your mistakes at midnight, calling yourself stupid for things a friend would never be judged for, holding yourself to standards you'd never dream of holding anyone else to, that it doesn't even register as unusual anymore. It just feels like the truth, but it isn't the truth. It's a habit, formed over years, reinforced every time you chose self-criticism over self-compassion, because somewhere, someone taught you that being hard on yourself was the same thing as being responsible. Picture the way you'd respond if a close friend came to you, shaking, telling you they made a huge mistake, that they feel like a failure, that they don't know how they'll ever forgive themselves. You wouldn't list every flaw they've ever had. You wouldn't remind them of every other mistake from the past 10 years. You'd probably say something like, "You're human. This doesn't erase everything good about you. You're allowed to mess up and still be worthy of love." Now notice, when you make a mistake yourself, is that the voice you hear? Or is it something colder, sharper, far less forgiving than anything you'd ever say to someone you cared about? This habit is about taking that same tenderness you've given so freely to others and finally redirecting some of it toward yourself. It doesn't mean ignoring your flaws or refusing to grow. Real love, even the love you gave others, was never about pretending they were perfect. It was about holding both truths at once. You have things to work on, and you are still worthy of patience while you work on them. This is exactly what you owe yourself. The same dual truth you extended so easily to people who didn't always deserve it as much as you assumed they did. Think of a garden you've tended carefully for someone else, watering it, protecting it from frost, pulling weeds gently instead of ripping through the soil in anger. Now imagine your own inner life as a garden that's been neglected for years, dry in some places, overgrown with weeds in others, not because you don't know how to tend a garden, but because you've spent all your tending on gardens that weren't your own. Learning to love yourself the way you once loved someone else means finally turning that same careful attention inward, watering the parts of yourself that have gone dry from years of criticism, pulling out the old, tangled thoughts that have been choking your sense of worth, and doing it with the same gentle hands you'd use on something you actually wanted to grow. This isn't a single moment. It's not a decision you make once and it's finished. It's a daily practice, small and often invisible to anyone else. Catching yourself mid-criticism and softening the words, noticing when you'd comfort a friend but are refusing to comfort yourself, and choosing, deliberately, to offer that same comfort inward instead. At first it can feel strange, even a little foreign, like speaking a language you learned a long time ago but rarely use. But the more you practice it, the more natural it becomes, until one day you notice you've stopped speaking to yourself like an enemy and started speaking to yourself like someone worth protecting. You were always allowed to be loved imperfectly. You gave that grace to others without a second thought. The work now is simply remembering that you were always included in that circle too, not someday, once you've fixed everything about yourself, but now, exactly as you are, mistakes and all, the same way you once loved someone else, without demanding they earn it first. Accepting that some chapters simply end. There's a particular kind of ache that comes from an ending you never got to understand. Not every relationship falls apart with a clear reason. Not every friendship fades because of one dramatic fight. Not every dream dies because of one obvious failure. Sometimes things just end, quietly, without a villain, without a clean explanation, and you're left standing there, holding a question that seems to have no answer, no matter how many times you turn it over. Why did this happen? Why now? Why like this? You search for the reason the way you'd search for your keys in the dark, patting down every surface, convinced that if you just look hard enough, the answer will finally turn up, and everything will make sense again. But some endings never hand you that satisfying reason. This is one of the hardest truths to accept, because you've likely been taught, without anyone saying it directly, that understanding is a requirement for peace, that you're not allowed to move forward until you've solved the mystery of why something happened the way it did. So you keep investigating. You ask mutual friends what they think really happened. You reread old messages, searching for a clue you might have missed. You build entire theories in your head about what really went wrong, sometimes changing the theory every few weeks, depending on your mood. And underneath all of that investigating is a quiet hope that if you can just find the right answer, the grief will finally make sense. And once it makes sense, it will finally stop hurting. The old teaching offers something different, something that sounds almost too simple at first. Not everything needs to make sense before you're allowed to heal from it. This doesn't mean you stop caring about truth, or that understanding never matters. It means recognizing that some understanding may never arrive, and building your healing around that possibility instead of putting your whole recovery on hold, waiting for clarity that might never come. Think about how much of your life has been spent in that waiting room, sitting patiently, expecting someone to eventually call your name and explain everything, when the truth is, some doors in that waiting room never open, no matter how long you sit there. There is a difference between processing grief and interrogating it. Processing grief means allowing yourself to feel the loss honestly, to cry if you need to sit with the emptiness left behind by something that mattered to you. Interrogating grief means treating your own pain like a crime scene, searching endlessly for the exact cause, refusing to let the case close until every question is answered. But grief was never meant to be solved. It was meant to be carried, gently, until it becomes lighter on its own, the way all weight becomes lighter over time when you stop adding new weight on top of it by constantly reopening the investigation. Consider the changing of seasons. Autumn doesn't arrive with a formal explanation for why summer had to end. The leaves don't ask permission before they start turning, and they certainly don't wait for a satisfying reason before they fall. The season simply changes, following a pattern far older than any individual tree's understanding of it, and the trees don't resist the ending by demanding an explanation. They let go, bare themselves completely, and quietly trust that what comes after will eventually bring something new. You are allowed to treat your own endings the same way, not because the loss doesn't matter, but because demanding a reason before you allow yourself to heal only delays a process that was always going to require your participation eventually, reason or no reason. Sometimes the healthier question isn't why did this end, but what do I do now that it has? This shift can feel almost uncomfortable at first, like abandoning a search you've spent years committed to. But notice what happens when you actually make that shift. Instead of your energy being spent endlessly circling the past, trying to extract a reason from it that it may never give you, that same energy becomes available for the present, for whatever comes next, for the parts of your life that are still unwritten and still waiting for your attention. The unanswered why doesn't have to be resolved before you're allowed to keep living. It can simply sit there, unanswered, off to the side, while you continue moving forward anyway. This doesn't mean forcing yourself to feel okay before you actually are. Acceptance isn't the same as forced positivity, and it isn't the same as pretending the loss didn't matter. Acceptance is quieter than that. It's simply loosening your grip on the demand that life explain itself to you before you're permitted to move on. Alongside whatever grief remains, there can be room for other things too. Small moments of relief, tiny sparks of curiosity about what's ahead, brief stretches of ordinary peace that don't require the mystery to be solved first. Grief and possibility are not opposites. They can sit in the same room together, at the same time, without one having to fully leave before the other is allowed in. Some chapters end without a bow tied neatly around them. Some questions never get their answers. And the sooner you can make peace with that unfinished quality, the sooner you stop waiting in a room for a door that may never open, and the sooner you turn around and notice that there are other doors, ones that are actually unlocked, ones that have been waiting for you this entire time, choosing presence over the illusion of control. So much of the exhaustion you carry doesn't come from what's actually happening in your life right now. It comes from the enormous, invisible effort of trying to control things that were never yours to control in the first place. You replay conversations, trying to figure out how you could have controlled someone else's reaction. You worry about the future, trying to control outcomes that haven't even happened yet and may never happen the way you're imagining. You obsess over the past, trying, in some strange way, to control something that has already finished happening, as if enough mental effort could somehow reach backward and rearrange it. All of this control-seeking feels productive in the moment. It feels like you're doing something useful, like you're protecting yourself by staying vigilant. But most of the time, it's simply exhausting you over things that were never within your power to begin with. Think about how much energy you've poured into trying to control another person's feelings toward you, trying to say exactly the right thing so they'll like you, trying to behave exactly the right way so they won't leave, trying to anticipate their moods so you can manage them before they even happen. This kind of control was always an illusion, because you cannot actually reach into someone else's heart and decide how they feel. You can be kind, you can be honest, you can show up consistently, but you cannot force someone to choose you, to stay, to understand you fully. Believing you can, even subtly, even without realizing it, keeps you locked in a constant state of tension, always managing, always performing, always slightly afraid that if you stop controlling the situation for even a moment, everything will fall apart. The old teaching points somewhere else entirely, not toward more control, but toward presence. Presence means being fully here, in this exact moment, with this exact breath, instead of living 3 steps ahead in an imagined future, or 3 steps behind in an unchangeable past. This sounds simple, almost too simple to be useful, but try it honestly for even a few minutes. Notice how much of your mental energy right now is spent on something other than what's actually in front of you. Maybe you're reading this while also worrying about a conversation you need to have later. Maybe part of you is still replaying something from yesterday. Presence asks you to gently pull all of that scattered attention back into this one moment, the only moment that was ever actually real to begin with. Control is loud, it's tense, it grips, it exhausts you with constant calculation, always trying to predict 10 steps ahead, always trying to prevent every possible bad outcome before it happens. Presence is quiet by comparison. It doesn't need to predict anything. It simply notices what's true right now. This breath, this room, this feeling moving through your body, without demanding that the next moment be controlled or guaranteed in any particular way. This doesn't mean you stop planning for your life or stop making thoughtful decisions. It means you stop confusing planning with controlling, and you stop believing that your worry is somehow protecting you from pain that hasn't even happened yet. Picture someone standing at the edge of a river, desperately trying to control the current, trying to slow it down, speed it up, redirect it exactly where they think it should go. No matter how hard they try, the river continues moving according to its own nature, indifferent to their effort. The only thing that struggle accomplishes is exhausting the person standing at the edge, using up energy they could have spent, simply being present beside the river, noticing its sound, its movement, its quiet, constant motion forward. Life moves the same way, indifferent to your attempts to control its current. The sooner you stop fighting the river and instead sit beside it, present and aware, the sooner your exhaustion begins to ease, even though the river itself hasn't changed at all. Presence doesn't mean passivity. It doesn't mean giving up on your goals or refusing to make choices about your life. It means making those choices from a grounded place instead of a frightened one, choosing your next step because it feels right in this moment, rather than because you're desperately trying to control every possible outcome 10 steps down the road. It means noticing, again and again, whenever you catch yourself gripping tightly to something outside your control, and gently, without judgment, bringing your attention back to what's actually true right now. This is a practice you'll return to over and over, not something you master once and never revisit. The mind will keep reaching for control, because control feels safer than uncertainty, even when it's exhausting you. But each time you notice that reaching, and gently choose presence instead, this breath, this moment, this ordinary Tuesday afternoon, you're building a different kind of strength, quieter than control, but far more sustainable. It's the strength of someone who has stopped fighting the river and started, finally, to simply live beside it. Here is the moment all of this has been building toward. The thing you've been trying to release was never actually a person, or a memory, or an old version of yourself. It was the silence you were afraid of feeling once you finally let go, the empty space where the pain used to live. You thought that emptiness would feel like loss, but it doesn't. It feels like room to breathe, room to choose something new. The silence isn't punishment for letting go, it's the reward. So when you think back to that question at the beginning, will I ever feel light again? The answer was never out there in some future date on a calendar. It was in the small, quiet releases, practiced one at a time, starting today. You don't need permission from anyone else to begin. You never did. If this spoke to something in you, subscribe, because there's more of this waiting for you.